Started. Welcome to this session of the 2024 Culture of Data Conference. So thank you for joining us. My name is Taylor Bostic. I use she, her pronouns. I'll be moderating this session. We also have Patrick Fiore, he, him, who's managing the Zoom and making sure the tech is running smoothly today. So everybody is muted now, but if you have a question during our Q&A session at the end, please feel free to unmute yourself. You can also use the chat box if you have any questions or if you need any assistance with tech throughout today's session. If you're comfortable with doing so, please add your pronouns to your Zoom name by clicking the three dots on your video square and selecting rename. So we have one presentation during this session. They'll present for approximately 25 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A afterwards. I'm personally really excited for this presentation and interested in learning more about the project outputs and all the information that our presenter has for us today. So I'll now turn it over to Dr. Anjanette Alejo-Steele to present community-based participatory research to end human trafficking.
Thank you so much, Taylor, for the kind introduction. I'm going to kick things off with a link to go along with my presentation, and starting off with my heartfelt thanks for all of you who chose to turn toward this issue. And I will be highlighting what this looks and how this feels in our state of Colorado. Okay, so let me do my sharing of this screen and get me to the presentation. All righty, everybody. In addition to being faculty at Metropolitan State University of Denver, where I've been for 28 years, in the Department of Health Professions in the Public Health Program, I come to you also as the co-founder and research director of the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking. So this is a separate from the university Denver-based endeavor where we have supported the state of Colorado in the ways that we understand trafficking. And I'm highlighting our Colorado project to comprehensively combat human trafficking. As with all presentations, I always want to be as survivor-centered and focused as possible. So we will have survivor colleagues help with the definition right off the bat.
Human trafficking is slavery.
And it happens all over America.
Any child, any woman, any man could potentially become a victim of human trafficking.
I am a victim of labor trafficking.
I was a victim of child sex trafficking, but now I own my body.
Human trafficking is any kind of forced labor.
It can happen to anybody.
I am a mother.
I am an author.
I am a son.
I'm an advocate.
I am an educator.
I'm a sister.
I am a brother.
I'm so much more than what happened to me.
I am strong.
I am brave.
I am outspoken.
I am compassionate.
I am a survivor.
I'm a survivor.
I am a survivor.
I am a survivor.
I am a survivor.
I am a survivor of human trafficking.
So this is a resource from the Office of Victims of Crime. Again, as we sit in the gravity and the dignity of survivors worldwide, I wanted to start with that very brief 1-minute video. We often ask folks to bring that video to staff meetings, to debriefings in law enforcement or police departments, just to break any stereotypes people have about what trafficking survivors look like, and that they are far more than what happened to them. And as I start with a fast introduction of my nonprofit, this is the vision of ending trafficking and informing social change that eliminates human exploitation broadly. And along that spectrum, human trafficking is, as they noted, the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel people into labor and or sex. Quickly going to just spend seconds on the 4 programs that the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, or LCHT, has delivered to the state of Colorado. We do training and education. We also have a wonderful leadership development program. We've had well over 200 students, volunteers, retirees from around the world come to Colorado to understand how we address trafficking at the community level. I'm going to shamelessly ask you all to take a screenshot or pull out your phone to be able to have the hotline and the text line at your disposal. That will be in the PDF as well. We have been running the statewide hotline since 2013. I was the hotline supervisor between 2013 and 2016. We have about 40 hotline advocates who staff this 24/7. You can get food, clothing, shelter, basic needs, translation, legal advocacy, housing through this hotline, and most importantly, dedicated, trained and vetted resources, and trained and vetted resources for trained law enforcement. So you can call 911 for assistance. However, the chances of knowing for sure that the detective who shows up has been trained, you can have that assurance with the hotline. What I'm going to highlight today is one of our premier research projects coming out of LCHT in the ways that we do this work with community and following the lead of community in the ways that we collaborate toward a solution to end trafficking. And that's the focus of this session, which I'll cover very quickly. In addition to the definition in the video, it's hard for folks to get their heads around the scope of this issue, because when we're looking at global estimates, you are talking about 50 million people. 1 in 4 survivors are children. And when we look at cases in Colorado, we see these various forms that we can confirm through hotline and through prosecutions in ways that labor trafficking looks across our state. That resources do not just focus on the Denver metro area. We make sure that we cover not only rural, but frontier communities across the 64 counties of Colorado. So labor trafficking on the left side, and then forms of sex trafficking that we've had cases in Colorado. So a couple things just to note here. With migrant and agricultural labor, with influxes of folks coming in from other countries, we pay particular attention to newly arrived migrants. And what we're seeing on the sex trafficking side in Colorado is that we are seeing more parents pimping and sex trafficking their children to get diapers on the baby and to get food on the table or to make rent. So really quickly, because I want to get to the research aspects. The last thing is in the packet or in the PDF of these slides, you're also going to have Colorado data, which we'll just note come from different sources, not just law enforcement or FBI. You will see here that folks don't always go to law enforcement for assistance. They may have been harmed or abused by law enforcement. So we make sure that when we gather numbers to try to get an understanding of scope, you have to widen that out to service providers, and you have to widen that out to folks who call, let's say, the hotline to get a feel for what that feels like in Colorado. Some of you may have heard that Colorado is a hot spot for both labor and sex trafficking. And my humble response to that is, we don't know. As researchers, it is very difficult to tell. But the one thing I can tell you is Colorado is very well organized. With more than 20 task forces and coalitions doing this work, we move through the cases more efficiently. So if our numbers look higher, it's because we coordinate more efficiently. All right, Basic question for this research is, what would it take to end human trafficking in Colorado? And I'll highlight the methods in the ways that we have conducted this project now 3 times. Our goal is to collect data statewide, 22 judicial districts, 64 counties, every 5 years. So we now have the scope of about 10 years of being able to see what folks are doing to address human trafficking. And coming out of each project, you will have a statewide action plan where the data are reviewed by a statewide advisory committee, and I'll talk about that in a second, to guide efforts in Colorado over time. The piece I appreciate about this project is that it helps us to see how we're moving this proverbial needle. Are things actually being done in a way to best support survivors of labor and sex trafficking? And along the way, on the bottom of the slide, you will see we were one of the first states to have a governor's council in the country. Having governor support saying this is happening in our state is significant. Our council has about 30 representatives. Alrighty. 2 other aspects I want to highlight about thinking about human trafficking is response. So when we're looking at different communities, we're looking at these 4 Ps. Quickly, since it's a crime, most folks think about who's getting the bad guys, your detectives, your prosecutors, your judges, and the ways in which they are restricted and sometimes hamstrung by state legislation of what they can do as they build those cases. Protection, I've already mentioned, with the hotline, food, clothing, shelter, translation services, needs that can be supported for survivors across the state. But we also note the prevention efforts, folks who do know your rights work in the Geodetention Center in Aurora, or it's as basic as middle school safe to tell programs that talk about consent. So where there's a whole cadre of folks, public health people, you are the choir, where prevention efforts are also at the table. The last P is partnership. How do we work together so we don't trip on top of each other or get in each other's way? So those are the 4 Ps, but those aren't enough for us to have a good feel of anti-trafficking response. We also have to recognize there are other routes and other ways in which trafficking can appear. So you're seeing what we call parallel movements, where there are overlaps between those efforts and human trafficking. So if you have a parent pimping out their child on the internet, that's child abuse. But the forms and the ways in which the parent is benefiting financially off of the sale of their child is also human trafficking. That's sex trafficking. Same thing with immigration and immigration influxes into the state when people are desperate to make rent, get food on the table. Newly arrived immigrants are at risk for being trafficked, being offered false promises of shelter and pay. So just noting a few of these overlaps, because I'm widening the ways in which thinking about human trafficking really does involve a public health approach because of the ways that we look at not only community responses with the 4 Ps, but what are the conditions in those communities that make trafficking possible? I'll talk just a touch about those parallel movements in a second. Because this is the Culture of Data conference, I'm not spending too much time on CBPR in the ways that we work in and with and beside communities. We also, in this project, hold lived experience as important as traditional methods of gathering data. The other piece is to note, we highlight promising practices as opposed to best practices because we know how long that can take to establish. We also note when we address trafficking around the state, we don't want and shouldn't have different communities look like Denver response. It won't work. It won't happen the same way when we have task forces working in Durango, Colorado Springs, Steamboat, Glenwood Springs, Lyman. Those communities are working with the best resources that are available to them. So they shouldn't look like Denver or Colorado Springs. And I'll give you an overview here in a second. But these are the principles that have driven the methodology for this project, where every 5 years, we want to gather evidence-based practices to see what is being done to address trafficking. We want to support collaboration, and if the outputs support folks to collaborate for grant writing, getting additional resources, expanding the network of supports. Ultimately, we want to reduce incidence and prevalence. And it's helpful to have some data. Again, you're the choir. Wouldn't it be nice to go beyond best guesses and assumptions with some data? So as a nonprofit, that's our party line. Get some data that can help confirm your hunches and your best guesses. Next, across the board, so I'm sharing with you the questions that have stayed consistent across all of our Colorado projects. Again, 2013, 2019, 2023. We ask the same core questions each iteration. What is the nature of trafficking in Colorado? What is being done to address it? And quickly, because I'm going to highlight on 2023 data, 2013, we wanted to know how. So if you have beds or shelter beds, how many staff are bilingual? How many beds are available for transgender males? So it's not just whether services are being provided, but what is the nature of inclusive, culturally responsive ways to provide support and services. Quickly, in 2019, we really focused on the partnership aspects. How do you have an interprofessional, multidisciplinary response when you've got so many folks at that table? What is the nature of those 4 Ps that I mentioned earlier? Patrick, if you're seeing questions along the way that you want to flag me, I'm not able to see those as readily. I'm seeing a chat question here, maybe. 2023, we delved in a little bit deeper into the nature of partnership because people love the idea of working together, collaborating, but that's easier said than done. So we got at the nature of trust, equity, and effectiveness in the ways that you had folks work together, because it's not just the detectives building the cases, the social workers and the service providers have to support survivors while they wait 4 years from their identification to adjudication. That's the average length of time now that it is taking to try a trafficking case. So you need to have community supports in order to help support survivors in their own agency and recovery at their own place and pace. I'll also mention root causes at the very end of this presentation, if I can get to that. Here are the generally 18 to 20 task forces that exist around the state of Colorado. And these are the task forces who participated, all 18 of them, in the Colorado project in 2023 when we asked that question of how do you trust one another? What is the diversity of the task force members? How inclusive are they being of the communities they serve? And are you measuring the same outcomes and the same goals in terms of effectiveness? So I wanted to share this map because these were the participants. I'm going to skim past this in the interest of time, but you can look at our website if you're wanting to see the numbers. But our methods are surveys, focus groups, and interviews. And I want to give you just a little bit of the ways that we not only produce reports, we have action plans, and we have 7 regional profiles. to help folks who are entering into the field see where the gaps are and where they can slot in to support. Skimming through the next two slides, but I wanted you to get a good feel of why it takes 52 people to run the Colorado project. We have core teams who did the actual in the weeds design and execution of data collection. The most important group in this slide are our lived experience researchers. So on day one, when we started to design for Colorado Project 2023, these 5 were right in the mix of co-designing every step of the way. And it takes about 2 years from the runway to the execution to be able to conduct this, this research. We also include interns in that mix, staff, and we had 4 principal investigators. I'll highlight quickly here the nature of the 4 of us, because I'm a health psychologist and a social justice professor, sitting right alongside public affairs, social work, and public health. So there's a story to also be told that I won't go into detail about the ways that the 4 of us really had to translate and back translate to do the best we could by the design of this process. In this next slide, these are external to LCHT. And the 2 groups that I'm going to highlight here is that statewide advisory committee. These are practitioners, survivors, people on the ground, service providers, child welfare, Colorado State Patrol, Governor's Council representatives who reviewed the data together and came up with recommendations for the state of Colorado. So that we used World Cafe methodologies in the ways that we started with 68 recommendations and distilled them down to 7 after deliberation. And as importantly, our action plan reviewers at the bottom of the slide are lived experience survivor leaders who then vetted that action plan just to make sure everything was survivor-centered, trauma-informed in the ways that those recommendations read and are being executed now. All right. This is the action plan. This is the cover. And the goal, again, is to coordinate efforts and to guide and direct collective efforts to end trafficking in Colorado. So in the chat, I put the link to the report and also on the page for Colorado Project, you will see at the bottom, if you scroll down, the 7 regional reports as well, so that you have a good feel of what efforts are underway, but what are the elements of partnership that we really need to pay attention to best support survivors of labor and sex trafficking. These 7 recommendations that I want to highlight tie to this piece about inclusion. So I'm really only going to cover the inclusion and housing aspects coming out of this report. There are 3 others that focus on training, setting shared goals as a partnership, and networking across partnerships, across task forces in Colorado. But I'm going to highlight just the 2 for the purposes here. And I'm watching my time, Taylor, so just know my eye is on it. When we look at the statewide priorities, and again, you're listening to voices across the state, these are the biggest priorities. Housing instability and homelessness is a top challenge. It creates vulnerability. And then in terms of supporting survivors, we are lacking terrifically, but that's nothing new to all of you. We see challenges with housing insecurity and homelessness across the entire state. But we wanted to make sure we highlight that importance first and foremost. The second 2 that focus on equity really are about engaging community members, marginalized groups. We've spent a lot of time in spaces with our colleagues in immigration systems, tribal communities, supporting advocacy on LGBTQ plus identities and youth experiencing homelessness, because these are still amongst the most vulnerable groups across the state. And when we look at membership of those 18 task forces and coalitions, really challenging them to be as inclusive as possible in the membership beyond serving diverse communities. So this is tough, but in the next 5 years, before we do Colorado Project 2028, this is what we're putting a laser focus on as we support those task forces. Along the way, I'm just going to highlight a few things. And again, you have the slides. I just want to highlight maybe one per slide to note when we look again at rural and frontier communities, the ways in which isolation makes everything harder between the transportation, lack of job opportunities, and having to transport people from, let's say, San Luis Valley to Denver for resources continues to be a challenge. So this report really called out, here's the nature of what trafficking looks and feels like in our rural communities. Again, isolation and need for housing continues to remain coming across tribal communities, and partnering with missing and murdered Indigenous relatives efforts that are happening in the state. We have partnered very closely with the not only rural but urban tribal communities in order to understand the nature of how people with Native Indigenous identities are at risk for being trafficked. Again, I know I'm moving through this pretty quickly. We've also examined, and what bubbled up in the themes were challenges in immigration policy and process protocols that create more vulnerability for immigrants trying to come into Colorado and assimilate. Challenges with work visas, challenges with employers, and the ways in which immigrants are hired are another area that we really need to focus more squarely on. Alrighty. I think all I want to do is highlight here the names or the descriptions of the recommendations here. These two that are on inclusion, I already noted around engaging survivor leaders. Not every task force has survivor voice amongst them. So that piece about inclusion of survivor leaders to help drive and direct anti-trafficking efforts are important. And then the second one here is about the composition of the identities of the members of these partnerships. All right. As I'm looking at time, I might go maybe 1 minute over. I noted this piece about importance of housing, and I really, just want to highlight a few things here where people are trading sex for housing and housing resources. So when we partner across movements, doing so not only helps us to understand where housing advocates add trafficking to their purviews, and having housing and shelter managers keep trafficking on their radars. That's one piece on that half. The other piece is that anti-trafficking folks need to have housing as one of the biggest priorities to shine the light on the needs of housing gaps going forward. So you're going to have, again, in the slide deck, in the reports, quotes and ways that we are currently seeing the challenges of different diverse communities who are at risk. Alrighty, I'll skim through this. I think I want to to note that coming out of the action plans, the ways in which we do need to think about policy shifts, not just in the anti-trafficking space, but on this slide, you're seeing where policy shifts within housing also have to happen. So it's not just research that sits on the shelf. We sit actively in the ways that we partner and co-design this research project, the ways in which the advisory committee assembles these recommendations. So I'm introducing this piece here about partnering across movements, across efforts going forward. So I think I'm going to pause here because I know I'm attending to time. It's about 3 o'clock to see if I might be able to help answer any questions. And I've come through a lot of information in a very short amount of time.
Thank you, Anjanette. That was an amazing presentation. At this time, we will start our question and answer session. So I encourage people to unmute themselves if they feel like voicing their question, or also dropping it in the chat at this time. And I'll start with the one question we do have in the chat already by Anika. Thank you for asking this question. It says, how can we raise awareness about domestic trafficking through a public health lens? There's a lot of attention on international trafficking, and films like The Sound of Freedom are popularizing this view. It seems having an inaccurate understanding of what trafficking looks like can be dangerous because it takes away attention from the issue that's right in front of us.
Bingo. Thank you, Annika, for this comment. That's exactly why we conduct the Colorado project. So you have readily available information about Colorado, because when you can talk about, for example, tourism or farm to table operations, like we love going to restaurants where there's farm to table and beautiful organic produce that's being delivered to our tables. Well, you have to think about the labor of the people who are picking your beloved butter lettuce and have your Colorado specific examples of where we've seen labor trafficking happen, right? So Grant Family Farms, really quickly, so this is a Colorado case, was not only the primary producer of organic produce for the state of Colorado, but nationally. Colorado Legal Services led this massive case, and it wasn't the family who was trafficking the laborers, the farmers, it was the brokers who were hiring. They were the ones who were trafficking folks. But we know as public health dedicated people, we like organic produce. But when you have organic produce, you actually need more hands and people on their knees because you can't fly over a farm with pesticides anymore. So I'm inviting you in your ways to increase and raise awareness. One, have these reports on hand. You've got the links, you've got ways. We've got a governor's council. There are many efforts that are already happening statewide about localizing what that looks like. If you go to that website, you can even localize it to your region. So there are 7 different regions. Let me just get to that really quickly because it's such a good piece. Super fast. Let's share this. Okay, because you have community profiles where you're going to hear from survivors and practitioners who are doing this work specific to your region. So we've broken up the state into 7. So there are 7 reports that can help you talk about it's in our backyard, but you'll have data, you'll have resources that are tailored to that region to help in those efforts, Annika. So not only in this conference, but thinking about public health conferences, where do public health practitioners congregate? Where can we keep this in front of them? Thank you for your question. Again, thank you for not turning away. I know you have choices. You could have gone to 3 other sessions and you decided to come hang in this space of force, fraud, coercion, and violence. So I'm grateful.
Yes. Any other questions?
Are there some counties not in any region? Nope, every single county is represented. Let me go back to this. That's a great question. I'm also very happy if you're needing to find out which region your particular county is located in. I'm happy to be able to highlight that. Yes, Eagle County is definitely in here. I want to say, my goodness, my screens are blotting out. So Eagle County is going to be, let's see here. 2, 3, 4. It's so tiny. You're right. It is so hard to be able to see where that is. Region 2, possibly region 3. What's wonderful is that there are many folks in Summit County, particularly, lots of organizations in Glenwood Springs that help to support and address not only newly arrived migrants, but folks who have been doing anti-trafficking work for some time. I'm very happy, Karina, to be able to send you additional names or resources. Awesome. Thank you.
Do the human trafficking workforces that you mentioned earlier in your presentation do any proactive investigations? And if not, is that something they're considering? I know I'm sure they're pretty busy doing reactive investigations, but just wondering.
Yeah. So in the realm of sex trafficking, so I'm just going to put a caveat on that. So there are what are called stings that are led by FBI. The most popular one is called Operation Cross Country, where they arbitrarily pick a night or a couple of nights where they train local law enforcement. And it takes about 15 to 20 people to set up what's called a sting. So the way a sting can look in that proactive space would be looking at postings on sites where officers will set up ways to be provided sex, but the goal is not to arrest the person who is offering sex services. The goal is to get the people in the parking lot and down the street, because those are the pimps and the traffickers who have set up for this transaction to happen. So that's one space in which proactive and looking for cases. Again, they don't announce what the night is going to be because that needs to be a surprise. And the priority for those evenings is to focus on minors in the sex industry. And I'll just note, 2 or 3 years, Colorado and Denver specifically has been on the top of that list a few times. The challenge, however, is that the last time Colorado was highlighted in an Operation Cross Country was when they, and this is deep breaths, everybody, this is difficult, where they identified a 3-year-old and a 5-month-old. Because the nature of demand and the ways in which people are purchasing and seeking sex are changing to include little ones and the elderly.
Thanks for answering that. Yeah. It is such a hard topic to talk about and to research. So I thank you so much for all of your work.
Oh, thank you. And again, I think the most important piece is making sure we have, and we have amongst the most diverse set of researchers, ensuring that we have lived experience researchers in the co-design was supremely important to us going forward. And the one piece I think for public health is to really think about the stereotypes about who's worthy, and to make sure we're not being blinded by the ways that undocumented or DACA undocumented folk, migrant farm workers, immigrants, right now, we are living in a society where those stereotypes are just running rampant in terms of othering these communities. The difficult part of that is if we're othering marginalized communities, or we are seeing them as less worthy, they're never going to be identified as survivors of labor or sex trafficking. So this public health approach really has to break open wide to be able to work with sex workers, to work with people who are experiencing homelessness, people who are have or grappling with addictions, which are some of the hardest populations with whom to work. And we get it. We hear it from practitioners. They're tough cases and they're difficult. But just because they're difficult doesn't mean they may not be experiencing exploitation or harm. So that's the broader piece around inclusion and radical inclusion, to make sure when we're listening for stories of violence and exploitation that we are as inclusive as we can be, because people who are experiencing or struggling with addiction, they're coping. Taking an additional 10, 15 minutes to understand what they're coping with may get you to understanding the nature of exploitation or violence.
Another question in the chat. Can you speak to how the DA's office is working to bring justice to the issues as well as prevent this from happening, and how current legislation you mentioned keeps them hamstrung, and how or if legislation is changing to prevent this?
Yes, this is an ever evolving set of work. And I think you are the choir in understanding that. What I love, and I'm just going to note this super fast, because what's nice is that you're highlighting a few slides I wasn't able to get to. So I'm going to use one DA's office as one example here. I'm going to move my screens to go to full screen. This is Denver Anti-Trafficking Alliance, which is led by the Denver DA's office. So when we look at the recommendations coming out of the statewide action plan, here's what the Denver DA's office is stepping into to be able to ensure that inclusion and to follow what those recommendations are. Now, I want to make sure I'm getting at your question here, Jenny. So bringing justice to the issue is keeping the spotlight on the issue with which to begin. And the ways in which, again, those partners collaborate must be inclusive in making sure you're not missing voices, and making sure that those diverse voices also have a place to make that legislative change. Now, I know your question isn't about this, but maybe many of you this morning heard about one of the bills that came through about statutes of limitations on child abuse and child abuse experiences. I can't see you all, so I don't know if anybody's nodding, but we in the anti-trafficking space we were sitting in, oh no, because it's not going to advance to the Colorado Senate. But thinking about child abuse, and you're seeing these ongoing struggles, and we could go on for hours in talking about what happened and what was announced today. But when you note this piece about keeping things hamstrung, we pay attention not just to anti-trafficking legislation, but again, child abuse legislation, legislation around immigrants. You have to think more broadly about the forms of legislation that can hinder and make things harder. So after this morning's news story, we're sitting in, okay, so if we have folks who were trafficked while they were children before, I think it was 2000, they won't be able to bring those cases forward. So I'm not fully answering your question, Jenny, except to say we have district attorneys, representatives, judges, folks who are in the criminal justice system who also not only participate in this project, but also work hard to advocate for making legislative changes. Having data, again, helps point to the evidence for the needs for these changes, which is why one of those right now is housing. So on this last slide, if everybody is noting the challenges of vulnerability and risk in shelters and keep underscoring the need for housing for survivors, we will make some headway in the housing space.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I had a quick, I mean, not much of a question, but a comment on the housing. And I'd like to thank you for spotlighting the rural and frontier areas as well. I live in Custer County, and I can remember before even getting in with public health, some local business owners, they used to own a meat market actually, and they were starting at the time, I don't know where it's at right now, but a safe housing nonprofit or a bit or something going for victims of human trafficking. And at the time I was kind of like, huh, really? Here in Custer? Like, how and why? And I'm thinking sex trafficking or things like that in urban areas. And I think you just proved the point throughout your presentation that it is just so much more. And some of these rural and frontier areas do have some serious issues ourselves. And so I'd like to, I mean, I don't know if you've heard of anything from this safe housing idea here or other places. Is it kind of like almost like a sober living house or just like a community type housing where they kind of provide safe housing for the victims until they can find somewhere else?
Yeah, we've seen the gamut of the ways that housing has been started and has failed. There is but I want to highlight one. I'm going to get the name wrong. There is a new, it's not just a shelter for youth in Colorado Springs. I want to say it's like Spotlight, where it's not just providing the beds, it's being able to provide job readiness, it's financial skills and being able to save and being able to budget. So this is a shelter and a living situation that also has education as part of that, because at the end of the day, it's not just the roof over your head, it's what can help with the sustainability and the agency of not only youth, but again, potentially survivors of labor and sex trafficking to move beyond and not return to their trafficking situations, because that's what they know. I know I'm shortchanging the ways in which this impacts people because I want this had to focus on research, but I like what you're asking here, Patrick, and the ways that you're thinking about housing and then also the rural piece.
Yeah, thank you. I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, we're a little bit over time, so thank you all for hanging in there. Before you log off, I just have a couple of announcements. So thank you so much for taking the time to attend this session and engage in the Q&A. The slides and any additional handouts that Anjanette has provided are available on Sketch. So you can have that available. You'll receive a conference evaluation form via email once the full conference is over. So as I'm sure you've probably heard in every session you've been in, please complete it. There'll be a raffle for a $50 gift card to 2 people that have created it. So we'll now have a short break before our day 1 debrief session at 3:30. So that'll be from 3:30 to 4:30. We'll have some casual networking virtually, and we also have a trivia game. So if you want to, test your wits there, then I'll see you right after this session. So for tomorrow, we'll pick right back up at 8:45 a.m., starting with the Emerging Leaders Showcase, which is also an amazing session with some of our rising stars in public health. So I encourage everybody to 1, go to the day 1 debrief following this session, and 2, to attend the Emerging Leaders Showcase bright and early 8:45 tomorrow morning. Thank you, everybody.